So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Let me start with giving the context of the panel today. So India's economic engagement with the Gulf has entered a new phase with two comprehensive economic partnership agreements, these so-called CEPAs, in the Gulf. A well-established one with the UAE that has already delivered successes, and we'll be delving into that, and a newly concluded one with Oman that is expected to follow a similar trajectory. In parallel, negotiations have been announced with Bahrain and exploratory discussions are taking place with Qatar. Together, these developments raise important questions not only about the bilateral impact of each agreement, but also about the longer term political and economic feasibility of a future Gulf-wide trade framework between India and the GCC as a bloc. I am joined for this panel by Jennifer Gnana, who's an assistant business editor at The National and a multilingual journalist with over 14 years experience covering the Middle East, specializing in political and energy reporting. She has reported from Iran and Gulf states such as Bahrain and the UAE for international and regional outlets, bringing deep expertise in political economy and energy affairs. I'm also joined by Ehtesham Shahid, who's a consulting editor at Trends Research and Advisory and has worked as a journalist and editor at several leading media outlets and think tanks in India and the Gulf region for over 2 decades. He teaches media and communications at universities in the UAE. He has also recently published his book, The Roaming Bahari and His Bag Full of Stories, a collection gathered over his 2 decades living and working in the Gulf and the Middle East. Now, before we turn to our panel, it is worth noting that this discussion is taking place against the backdrop of a very significant development that occurred just yesterday. At the invitation of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan conducted his 5th official visit in a decade and his 3rd as President of the UAE. The two leaders announced that since the signing of the CEPA between their countries in 2022, bilateral trade has reached $100 billion in the year 24-25, and both sides have now set an ambitious target of doubling this annual figure to $200 billion by 2032. Beyond trade, there are LNG supply agreements that have been announced, as well as cross-border payments, and a signing of a letter of intent towards a strategic defense partnership and a renewed commitment to the India-Middle East-Europe corridor, the IMEC. Taken together, these announcements do not merely confirm the success of the UAE-India CEPA, they illustrate how trade agreements are now anchoring a much broader strategic relationship spanning energy, finance, defense, and connectivity. This makes today's discussion particularly timely, and it is with this context in mind that I am pleased to open our panel for opening remarks, starting with Jennifer.
Thank you, Mahdi, and thank you to the ORF for inviting me to speak on this panel. Gulf-India relations are incredibly historical. If you grew up in the region as I did, you probably know someone whose family moved here pre-partition and still lives and trades in the region. In Bahrain, for instance, where we both grew up, the relations are thousands of years old. Trade ties go back to the Indus Valley civilization and Bahrain's Dilmun civilization. And today, the trade ties between the countries still remain at a personal level. There are families that have traded for centuries. There's merchantry, there's craftsmanship that is still very important in underpinning trade between both states. Also, if you look back in the day, the Trucial states as well as Bahrain used the rupee as a currency for trade. And today, the relationships between the Gulf states and India still remain personal. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has an incredibly personal relationship with several of the leaders in the Gulf. During yesterday's visit, for instance, it was the president of the UAE's 5th visit to India and his 3rd as president. And Prime Minister Modi has visited the UAE around 7 times. Now, India was the first, I have to rephrase this. India had a broader pattern of signing the comprehensive economic partnership agreements with a number of countries, and the UAE and India signed this agreement in 2022, and it was the quickest agreement that they negotiated. It took around 88 days, which was a record for India, and during the visit yesterday, as Mahdi said earlier, the plan is to boost current trade ties, which averaged 95 billion US dollars to around 200 billion by 2032. What is interesting for me as an energy journalist is also the changing nature of some of the trade components between the two states, and we can talk about the UAE, for instance. India has always been concerned about energy security, particularly from the Middle East, which is a source for nearly half of its oil imports. And both the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait are big suppliers of crude to India. Iraq, on the other side of the Gulf, is also a big supplier. This has changed in terms of imports, but India is still quite keen to continue to maintain this oil trade. But the nature of its energy relationship has changed. As Mahdi said earlier, India signed an agreement for import of LNG. With energy transition and with the changing nature of India's own energy mix, India is looking to import more gas. And in this sort of evolving nature of India's own energy mix, relationships with the UAE and also Qatar, which is the biggest supplier of LNG to India, has changed. So these will continue to underpin any economic relationship that India negotiates with the UAE and in the future with Qatar and also with other countries.
Thank you, Jennifer. Ehtesham, if you may also give us your opening remarks.
Okay, so thanks, Mahdi, for inviting me here, and thanks to ORF Middle East for organizing these events. I was just mentioning to someone that, I've been in my private conversations with a lot of Indian diplomats working here in the UAE, calling for a platform such as this, where both sides can sit and discuss the modalities of trade and address wherever awareness issues arise and other challenges that come with trade. Of course, India UAE has been a story, a trade story with compared to few others around the world. So there's a lot of sound, solid base when it comes to that. Now that Jennifer mentioned energy interdependence is one area that is always talked about when we talk of India UAE trade. There is also the remittance part that India eyes, and then there is the and around labor flows and things like that. But since we are discussing CEPA, I would just try and run through what happened before CEPA and how CEPA has changed the game. So if you go back, it was basically about energy and gems and jewelry and bullion markets and things like that, with very little focus on. There was focus, but then probably not sufficient for a scale of this kind on trade regulations and other areas that kind of define long-term sustainable trade practices. Now, we also have to be mindful of the changes that are happening around the world. So the tariff regimes are very rapidly evolving in recent months, especially. So, but then these free trade agreements have been in the pipeline. So, if you look at India, New Zealand, and India, UK, and other things evolved. When it came to a corridor for Africa and Europe, UAE was the natural choice for India. And the moment it was understood that an India GCC free trade agreement is not going anywhere, or at least not getting the momentum it deserved, I think it was fairly natural for India to forge one with the UAE. That was the first choice anyways. Now that it has happened with Oman, there is possibility of Qatar and Bahrain coming into the picture. Now, whether that makes an India GCC free trade agreement still relevant or not, probably only time will tell, and it's for the policy makers and experts on both sides to figure out. But overall, the focus has shifted from India from the larger base, if I may call it that. Sorry, larger base has shifted from there to a more sustainability driven. Now there are lots of areas that I've actually jotted down. We can come back and discuss them. But what I would sum up the change pre-CEPA and post-CEPA is a more infrastructure driven, sustainable, and probably bringing in more digital interfaces, and AI and other things would take it to another level. So it has been a paradigm shift. CEPA has been a paradigm shift for India-UAE trade relations, and it promises to set up a template that can be replicated elsewhere in the region. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much. So I think to a large extent, you've both placed the CEPAs between India and the UAE, as well as partly India and Oman, as part of kind of global CEPA links that India has. I think you've both mentioned that. Now, how does the global developments at the moment in terms of tariff wars and other things that perhaps the United States and other countries are leading, how does that position the Gulf India trade? And how do the CEPA frameworks put them in a unique position?
That's a very good point, and that should be the next question on the table. Simply because trade has not been, if you leave out the India UAE and India Saudi bilateral trade that has been gaining momentum in recent years, India have had its challenges in this region in areas such as Chabahar, the Iran port interface. So now that like years of effort appears to have gone nowhere. So it was making sense collectively. When I say collectively from an Indian point of view, not so much from a GCC point of view, to further what's achievable in terms of trade agreements. And I think that is why the leadership on both sides should be commended for putting their weight behind these free trade agreements. And I think that it'll kind of shift momentum from more multilateral engagements to more bilateral engagements, because that is where you can quickly, as Jennifer mentioned, the quickest FTA was achieved because it was a bilateral agreement. It would never have been possible. Even the earlier FTA that India managed to sign with New Zealand was closed in 8 to 9 months. No bilateral. I mean, India, EU is another example. It's been in the pipeline. The GCC EU trade agreements have had difficulties. So I think it's the sign of times and changing tariff structures around the world that's pushing countries like India and UAE and smaller countries to go more bilateral than multilateral. And I think that'll be the path forward in the coming days, months and years ahead.
Thank you. And Jennifer?
I'll add to that. I think the tariff war that we saw last year and the tariffs that Trump has unleashed on several economies have motivated several stagnant discussions to accelerate. We've seen the UAE and Canada, for instance, pick up negotiations that were stalled for a long time because of Trump's tariffs. And we've also seen the EU and the GCC revive talks that had stalled before. So there are lots of economic blocs, lots of countries that are trying to get a good deal bilaterally if they can, which is why we're seeing an acceleration when it comes to these. For India specifically, when it comes to the Gulf, energy still remains critical. I say this because I cover energy a lot, but also it is one of the most important concerns. Any supply disruptions would have a very significant impact on the Indian economy. India's approach to free trade agreements with Gulf states reflects several different concerns. For instance, with the UAE, it is to make sure that there is security of supply. The UAE has parked significant, barrels in India's strategic reserves. There are discussions with Kuwait. There are discussions with Saudi Arabia that there are plans for refineries, which is again to lock in this crude. But when it comes to other countries like Oman and Qatar, for instance, there are different kinds of concerns. For Qatar being the biggest source of LNG, it is to make sure that India can sustainably secure natural gas supplies from very close to where it is geographically. And when it comes to Oman, it is also several of the developments that we've seen hinge on its concerns about the security of the region as a whole, like the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, for instance. And to make sure that it has an easy access to its goods, it has an easy way to access Africa, which is a big market for Indian businesses. And it was also something that came up in the president's visit yesterday, because there were a few specific infrastructure projects that we're talking about, Bharat Mart, Virtual Trade Corridor, and also the Bharat Africa Setu meaning bridge to Africa. Now, in Oman specifically, there are many Indian businesses who invested in the Sohar, in the Duqm and the Salalah free zones. And these are all geared to make sure that India has an alternative to the Strait of Hormuz, given the tensions that we've seen since last year in that region. So India has been planning a number of infrastructure developments and has also been, working on these free trade agreements with a sense to secure both oil and natural gas supplies in a sustainable and secure way for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Now, I think we've spoken about the perspective from India as to kind of the benefits of these CEPA agreements and as well as any potential trade agreements with the GCC, despite whatever bottlenecks exist. Now, from your reading, what is the perspective from the GCC as experts, not just in India, but also on the Gulf? What are the added benefits for UAE, let's say for Oman now with the CEPA, of signing these CEPAs with India? In particular, I think with the perspective that UAE has been signing a lot of CEPAs, despite India being early in that drive, but Oman I don't think has had much of a CEPA drive. How do you situate that CEPA agreement with India?
I think it's a good point because it also creates discord in that sense. I mean, discord probably would be a harsh word to use, but there have been occasions in the GCC when they've gone ahead and closed free trade agreements without taking the whole of GCC into consideration. Now, when you do that, and I think it happened with Bahrain and Oman in 2007 or 8 when it signed FTAs with the United States, and I mean, it may be very good for both sides, but from a GCC perspective, it's breaking of ranks, and that is when alternative thinking starts to kick in, and then countries start taking into consideration its own requirements and priorities, and not jump onto a GCC bandwagon. Now that might be counterproductive to GCC as on the whole. Now. Again, you cannot challenge any sovereign country's right to close these deals, but it's just that there has either not been enough opportunities or considerations for a GCC-wide free trade agreement with India or other countries around the world, and simultaneously bilateral trade with countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia is still in the pipeline, but Oman there has been so much momentum in these trade agreements that it was not natural for the two sides to enter into a CEPA kind of an agreement. So it's kind of contradictory in many terms, but it's way forward, and way forward kind of suggests that there are if two of the 6 GCC countries are down and the third and fourth are on the way, then it's literally it's already an India GCC free trade agreement. But again, the size and scales of these economies are different. They have different. I mean, you can look at finance in Bahrain and you look at Oman, and there are very, very different trajectories. So you cannot judge them all their countries, all the countries in the region and their requirements. So I think it was bound to happen because GCC collectively was not closing the deals that they should have for whatever reasons. That probably a matter of another discussion. But it was bound to go bilateral, especially considering the circumstances that Jennifer mentioned and the tariff ecosystem that has just evolved after Trump became president for the second time around. So what I would say is it's unlikely that the whole GCC will go back on the drawing board and think of devising a strategy through which it can come together and do. I mean, there's no point doing an India GCC free trade agreement now when India already has an FTA with a CEPA with UAE and Oman. So it's still evolving, and it's also suggests that there are lots of possibilities on the ground, on the table, and that's why we should imagine, put our imagination on, make them wild, and just. I mean, I would just give one example. Every time the US president has come to this part of the world, we've had countries like Jordan and Syria on the table. Now they're sharing the stage with GCC leadership, which kind of suggests that GCC could be is probably underachieving in this bigger gain in bringing more countries together so that there is some momentum when it comes to intra-regional trade. If you look at at how Yemen has shaped, we can go back to 2005, 2006 when there was possibility of Yemen joining the GCC. It never happened. So there is always missed opportunities, and which all opens up for new formations and combinations.
Thank you. And Jennifer?
So I'd like to talk a bit more about the different, about the nature of the Gulf economies. They're not all the same. And even when we look at the Gulf states as, energy producing nations, they're not equal. For instance, Saudi Arabia obviously is the world's largest exporter of oil. The UAE has significant production of oil, as is Kuwait. But Bahrain has been having declining production despite being the first country in the Gulf where oil was discovered. Oman is also a small producer. Bahrain and Oman are not part of OPEC. Obviously, they have different concerns when it comes to negotiating free trade agreement compared to Abu Dhabi or Doha or Riyadh. And also, like one of the things that we talked about before is physical mobility. Now, not all the GCC states will be okay with, for instance, visa on arrival access, which Bahrain has now enabled for Indian citizens. Oman is also, liberalizing access for Indian businesses to come and set up base in Oman. That is not the case when we compare with Saudi Arabia, which is still, when it comes to ownership of assets, when it comes to foreign investment, even though they've liberalized to a great extent when it comes to their foreign exchange, etc., it is different. So the reality for each of the Gulf states is different. Firstly, whether they are an exporter or whether they're a small producer, whether they're a big investor. Now, Qatar, for instance, is a big investor in the Indian economy. During the Emir's visit last year, Qatar said it was pledging $10 billion into the Indian economy. And the Indian Commerce Minister said around 1.5 billion had already been, funneled, or not funneled is the wrong word, but has already been deployed into the Indian economy. And there's more on the way. Now, Bahrain and Oman are looking for more inward investments from India. They're looking for Indian businesses to come in. And Bahrain is the same, in technology, in green energy, in green hydrogen for Oman. So to have a unified GCC pact with India, it does not serve the nations as well. It's better to have the GCC states, look at their strengths and weaknesses, look where they need investment, where they would like to invest, and negotiate deals that are better for them and also better for India.
Okay, so I think we've had slightly contrasting opinions here, and I want to just drill down on where the contrast lies. So I think, Ehtesham, you've mentioned that, well, if, and I'm paraphrasing here, if all 6 Gulf countries sign trade agreements or CEPAs with India, then there is really no need for a GCC-wide framework because that's already been kind of de facto achieved through these bilateral arrangements. On the other hand, I think, Jennifer, what you're saying is, and I'm paraphrasing again, is that, well, there are distinctive trading relationships and economic relationships that exist between each Gulf country and India, and that leads me to ask this question. If there are these distinctive relationships, are we seeing, based on any knowledge or reading of these agreements from what's out there, are we seeing different terms and conditions in these negotiations and bilateral agreements and CEPAs that have been signed, at least between India and UAE and India and Oman, that leads us to believe that, okay, well, this distinctive economic relationship is being reflected through a distinctive agreement with respect to each country in India? So let me start with Jennifer.
I haven't looked at the full details of tariff exemptions and so on, but I do understand when it comes to the UAE and India relationship, there's a lot of focus on infrastructure investments. And I think in terms of all the CEPAs that have been negotiated, the India-UAE one is the broadest and the freest of most of them. When it comes to the India-Oman one that was signed, I have the numbers. It is 98.8 duty free. that is for Omani goods, and for tariff lines for India, it's like 77%. So there are differences. I don't have the numbers for the UAE, but they have been negotiated quite differently. And also in terms of the goods for Oman, it's mostly import of Indian goods. There are some petroleum products that go into India as well. But one of the big concerns for India as an importer is the premiums that India has talked about when it comes to petroleum products. And that would be a bigger concern when it comes to the UAE and also with Saudi Arabia. With the other states, it would be more of ease of access for Indian goods to be available in those free zones and in those trading areas. So those are the main differences as far as I can see.
And Ehtesham, what do you think based on where we're going?
It's interesting. That is where the devil is in the detail, because of course, when India and UAE sit across the table, they will have their own considerations in mind. Since India-UAE relationship has also been about re-export that has happened from Dubai, that's a legacy that no one can ignore. I think that will continue to be part of the conversation. And I think the digitalization and of greater focus on digital payments and things like that are also a byproduct of that line of thinking. Oman, unless it presents itself as an alternative to the UAE as a re-export hub for Indian products, not so much services, but definitely products, then there might be more competition than complementarity on both sides. So that's where the secretary level thrashing out of the details work. Now, for instance, it's a very vivid example, but when I see a lot of Indians coming to the UAE and trying for a job, if they call me, what I tell them is, there are too many people chasing too few jobs here. Now, it's also about, when we talk about human mobility and, talent and workforce, we have to be, a country like India has to be mindful that if people are coming here in droves, and there are bigger economies like Saudi Arabia and Oman where there are not too many IT professionals and others going in, those are small areas that tweaking will need to happen on both sides. So the UAE would know that a golden visa scheme is great to get talent and soft power or whatever it is from India. Oman will not look at it exactly like that. And when Saudi Arabia comes into picture, the circumstances change drastically. So of course there's one-to-one, and you can't have a one-size-fits-all solution for any of these trade deals. And going forward, there will be more review probably. For instance, I think there is a lack of focus on the SMEs in the UAE. There's not much awareness in India about how integral component SMEs are to this economy. So the more awareness drives like these there are that come out, there will be a greater understanding of these opportunities. So I think both sides will learn. Like 3 years have passed, so there would be a lot to exchange notes on about what are the areas to focus on next. And both sides, I think, are perfectly capable of tweaking those requirements and going forward when it comes to I think every 6 months, 3 months, they would need to evolve, because this is a very, very fluid situation that is evolving because of the trade agreements that have got expedited in the last few years. It's completely changed the dynamics of businesses.
I would also add that the UAE has slashed a lot of red tape, even though this country operates very minimally when it comes to red tape. But with initiatives like Bharat Mart and with other initiatives for Indian businesses to come here, they have been more transparent. They have been talking about it. They've been very clear when it comes to what fees should be paid, what are the processes. And I would say that in terms of the actual implementation of the CEPA and of the many things that have been discussed in workshops and in meetings since then, the UAE has offered a more clear blueprint of what is available for Indian businesses that are looking to set up either a base here to trade within the UAE or for re-export, or with a focus towards Africa. And that is quite different from what is available from other Gulf states.
Thank you. And I just want to ask kind of the final question before we open up for everyone to ask questions. We've talked about kind of the motivations a lot. We've talked about kind of a lot of the different considerations, but I think it's also important to just maybe conclude this segment of the panel with wondering what are the effects of these CEPAs. So what are the effects, for example, in terms of sovereign wealth fund investments from the GC into India? What are the effects, for example, in terms of the Gulf countries' increasing integration efforts? So, I would imagine that these agreements are prompting increased focus on resident GCC tourist visa, unified tourist visa. There's discussions probably about labor mobility, about infrastructure development through connectivity projects such as IMEC. So broadly speaking, what are, in your view, the most prominent effects that we could expect from the proliferation of India's economic relationship with the Gulf countries?
So it's a natural outcome. So what I see development such as Bharat Mart is it's very interesting, and I think it will be amalgamation of a lot of efforts that have gone into consolidate India UAE trade. But we know the elephant in the room is China, and when you talk about Bharat Mart, there is someone who has had the first movers advantage. Now that is where opening up the discourse and making people aware and trying to neutralize that advantage and to see how best we can present this economic opportunity for a lot of businesses in India without getting into the competition that can be avoided. So that is one way of looking at it. I mean, I'm sure there would be other interpretations of that the question that you posed. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is the food corridor. UAE food security has been a major component of their foreign policy. I mean, apart from climate change, I think food security has been in the limelight for the most of the time in the last few years. So, and India can bring a lot on the table as far as food security is concerned. I come from a state called Bihar. There is this product called makhana, which has suddenly become very important. It's foxnut, and foxnut is big in the United States, and now with this Trump tariff situation, now suddenly the makhana producers don't know where to go. Now the last mile manufacturing is something that the UAE has been talking about for a long time. So I can see from my village in Bihar, you can literally bring makhana here, and if you have a manufacturing base, I'm not giving away business ideas, I'm just thinking how best the synergies can be developed between the two sides. So there are a world of opportunities, and I think but the more discourse would be needed to fine tune and see what works better, and of course both sides will learn with time and move forward.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. In terms of food security, do you think, would you kind of extend this argument towards all of the Gulf countries as well, especially kind of Bahrain, I would think, in terms of food security, maybe even Oman? Is food security something that you would think that India could genuinely benefit the Gulf countries in that respect?
Both sides can benefit, because I mean, if there's a natural demand and supply situation here, and food is something that you cannot. I mean, somebody was telling me, why should UAE import chicken from Brazil when it can bring it from India? So that is, and it's kind of the nature of that business is proximity, and there is proximity between India and the UAE. So it's only a matter of time when these things come up. I know dairy and other products have been left out of some of these CEPA provisions, but eventually when things start to roll and the mechanisms are in place, more and more perishable goods would come into picture, and there would be greater collaboration on those areas as well. So we are headed in that direction, and it will be. I won't be surprised if you have another session just talking about what has changed in the last 6 months.
Well, we're always eager on having these sessions. Thank you.
I was really excited to hear about the fox nuts, because there's a really good detailed piece in Jazeera about the fox nuts and what's happened because of the tariffs. That fox nuts, which are considered superfood, but most of us who are Indian would have consumed them at some point. It's a very cheap snack. But it's become a superfood in the US, and because of the tariffs, I think a $2 fox nut would now be priced at what, $4? So so these fox nut producers in Bihar are looking for new destinations, and there are many that are actually coming to the UAE. I know this because they're so popular in my office, and many of them have been repackaged in the UAE. So it's just interesting, at a very small level, what this, small product, which is a big source of livelihood for this community in Bihar, and how they've had to, reorient their markets because of the tariffs. And I think that's really interesting. And that's a really detailed report. Someone spent a lot of time trying to speak to people, both who grew the fox nuts and also those who consume. So I highly recommend reading that. In terms of food security, I would say that because of these large-scale businessmen who, operate markets like Lulu, they source a lot of their produce from India. And we've also seen an increase in like cattle imports, which have happened over the last few years. So there's been a lot more imports from India, both because of the CEPA and previously as well. I would say that another aspect that is not often talked about is after the signing of the CEPA agreement in 2022, the UAE has gone on to replicate this model with a number of countries. Now, there's been, 28 countries that have signed the CEPA agreement with the UAE. It has finessed this model. And I think India provided the blueprint because they've been doing this for some time. And another aspect that I also want to highlight is it has helped in some aspects to liberalize flow of people. The GCC economies at different levels are in discussions with the Indian External Affairs Ministry to see how best they can allow for greater mobility to the Gulf states.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Now we know what's a popular food item in the national, so that's great to know. So I'd like to open up the panel to questions from the audience. It's great. We can see at least three. Let me start with you, ma'am.
You mentioned an elephant in the room, China. I want to ask about another elephant in the room, especially from energy security, which is Russia, which, Jennifer, you highlighted very much India's interest in energy security, but also the premium piece. And one of the dynamics in the last couple of years has been Russia taking larger market share that may be ending. There's dynamics here between the US and Russia and India, but I'm just wondering to what extent, how does the energy security piece versus the energy cost piece sort of come together in this dynamic? And, you might tell me there's a long-term story here. The other question is sort of one, it sounds like these greater interlinkages are also part of, for the UAE perspective, bringing what had been re-exports onshore, adding some value, those dynamics. So I've been interested in my own research to think about to what extent are re-exports going down and value added here. I guess that's still something to watch. These links are really interesting. So there's plenty more questions, but I really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you, Rachel. It's so good to have you in the UAE, and
you.
thank you for attending the panel. Now, when it comes to India's concerns over energy security, over the price point, that is at the heart of India's concerns and Indian oil policy as such. So last year, when the U.S. Treasury Department imposed these sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft, India turned to the Gulf states for imports. So Reliance, for instance, placed an order for 1 million barrels from Kuwait, and there was a drop in Indian imports from Russia, and there was a sudden spike in imports from Kuwait, from the UAE. However, India has been talking about this for a very long time. Hardeep Singh Puri has spoken about this, and his predecessor also spoke about this. India has always resented the fact that there's this premium placed on its imports from the Middle East, even though geographically it is the closest market, but Middle Eastern crude trades at a premium, and if there's access to cheaper barrels, which are Russian barrels, Russian Urals, India has made the strategic decision for a large country of 1.5 billion people to ensure that there's cheap access to fuel. Now, India, from a broader sense, India runs on coal for power generation. It is the cheapest form of fuel, and unless there's an alternative, we have nowhere to go. So India always chooses the cheapest barrel, and if there are Urals available, they have been allocated to refiners. Now, this has changed because India obviously wants to secure a good trade deal with the US. In our analysis and going through shipping data, we've seen that there was a strategic pause around the time when these sanctions were announced. But Indian refiners have gone back to buying more Urals. And this also comes with other geopolitical development when it comes to Venezuela, for instance. I mean, Indian energy companies are said to go back to Venezuela and, access the reserves that would be developed. But, that is a long shot. For now, Urals are trading at even more of a discount, which makes, Middle Eastern crude that is priced at a premium still quite expensive for India. So unless these CEPA agreements and trade negotiations can help India access crude that is affordable, Indian refiners will continue to choose the cheaper barrel.
Thank you. Ehtesham, do you want to comment? And
Yeah,
then we have
just
two
a
more
quick
questions.
comment. She's covered the whole gamut of it, so I don't need to add anything except for one. Thankfully, Jennifer missed out was Iran has been under sanctions, so that influences the energy mix, and that influences. So energy is such a market, and Jennifer knows much more about it than I do. Is that you have to go by what are the available options and how you ensure energy security, and that's all the Indian motivation is. Of course, the GCC would like to sell more, and but then they are also realistic about the changing market conditions, and of course OPEC plays a far greater role in that. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you put your hand up again if you want to ask a question? Okay, I see three. So I'll take all three and then we'll answer if that's fine. Just please keep it to a minimum in terms of the length of the question. Please.
Thank you for your remarks and responses. My question is about IMEC, and I think the time you've spent speaking about it perhaps reflects where it is now and its significance as per compared to when it was announced in 23. I noticed in the joint statement between His Highness President Mohammed bin Zayed and Prime Minister Modi, it was point 17 and 20 amongst 20 points, kind of a bit buried, and saying, we recall its launch and we would like to kind of re-energize it. So, of course, October 7th, 23, tensions in the region, some competition with other perhaps routes, the Iraq Development Road. Anyway, you know where the question is going. What's up with IMEC? Thanks.
Thank you. Kabir?
Thank you so much. Really great conversation. I just want to sort of bring back this question to the point of what the theme of the debate is, which is Gulf India trade. It seems like what we have talked about of how good certain sort of CEPA agreements are and how good trade between, let's say, Oman and India can become with the agreement that was signed. It seems that there is a level of comfort on bilateral engagements and bilateral relationships and bilateral agreements between states. So that, bringing back to the theme, where does that bring, let's say, Gulf India trade? So sort of from a regional perspective, there has been talks, as it was discussed, on a Gulf India, trade agreement as well. Is that because of the current situation of global geopolitics, where there's so much fracture, that such kind of agreements, which take in multiple countries, are very difficult to sort of achieve? They're anyway difficult to achieve, but more so now. And just as a final complementary point of view to this question, if India and EU sign the deal later next week, will that push something like the India GCC, envisioned India GCC trade agreement? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the discussion. I just have a question related to, we've spoken about UAE, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, but I have a question about Saudi Arabia's role in the Gulf India trade. There was a visit by President MBZ yesterday into India, and just a few days before that, there was Saudi and Pakistan and Turkey becoming part of what has been described as a Muslim NATO. So I wonder if that sort of defense agreement has any impact in your thoughts on the potential of a relationship between India and Saudi in the future. That's all. Thank you.
All right, Mana, do you want the next round? Is that fine? Thank you. So, because there's very diverse questions, but I think the common theme, at least in the first two questions, which, in terms of, okay, what's going on with IMEC, but then also what's going on with, which I think we briefly touched upon, but would be good to expand on, is your perspectives on a multilateral trade agreement and the prospect of how the EU trade agreement with India could change matters here.
Yeah, so IMEC, I only have a couple of sentences. It's a challenge, and I think it'll be addressed over time, and I think it will be too early to arrive at a judgment whether it is going in the right direction or not. I think it is, but of course, with a corridor of that kind, and if you have, I think the bigger problem was Turkey and Egypt getting left out of the corridor. Now, there could be several reasons behind it, but that probably has stalled the process, or at least slowed it down. But again, or maybe it's not just the priority at the moment. But I think it will also depend, something like IMEC will also depend on how formations such as I2, U2 shape, because there has been, and that has, again, can be attributed to the geopolitical circumstances that exist in the region. So IMEC is a tough one, and I think leadership on both sides are aware of that. And it will eventually happen when the circumstances are right, when the what you call when the circumstances are right on both sides to proceed further. I think one challenge with IMEC is funding, and sovereign funding especially is very critical for a corridor of this kind, especially from when you have multi-party stakeholders, all the stakeholders will have to be on the same platform when it comes to funding, and once that breakthrough is done, it will probably proceed, and simultaneously if the geopolitical circumstances improve as well. So that addresses the IMEC part. I'm sure Jennifer can add to that. And I think Kabir's question on multilateralism is, again, it will depend on how this, if India EU happens next week, I think that will be a game changer, and there's no doubt about it. And it'll probably change thinking within the GCC and other formations. But again, we also have to take into factor India-ASEAN free trade agreement, which did not go very far. So we'll have to go step by step to see how these things fructify. Once India EU fructifies, probably there would be a bigger momentum for India GCC. But at the moment, I think it'll be too hasty to jump to that kind of conclusion.
Thank you. We'll come to you, Jennifer, but I just want to add on that as well. I think, Kabir, it will also depend on EU GCC as well. So I think if the India EU relationship, prompts a stronger discussion in terms of EU GCC, then may as well probably kind of transfer up into India GCC following that, especially with the EU GCC summit happening this year. Jennifer?
I think Ehtesham has covered most of the points, but I'll just say that when it comes to Gulf India as an FTA, the GCC has struggled to find internal consensus on a number of issues. So to come to a consensus on a free trade agreement may not be the priority now. I would say this would become a priority when IMEC becomes more of a reality, which is not a priority for many of the states today. And there's actually an excellent paper published by Trends, one of your colleagues wrote about IMEC and the pause, and how she sees momentum picking up next year once India and the US have finalized a trade agreement and geopolitical tensions have minimized. So when that happens, I think a GCC India free trade agreement would make more sense for mobility of goods, for infrastructure projects, for financing to happen at that level. On your question, I think that's really interesting, and thanks for asking, because yesterday's visit also included a strategic defense agreement for the first time, which was quite interesting because mostly these agreements and discussions include energy and trade. Also, if you remember, with respect to Saudi Arabia, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Saudi Arabia last year, the visit was cut short because that was when India and Pakistan had, the flare-up. And what followed was quite interesting because for the first time, the Saudi leadership sort of mediated or had discussions or conveyed messages between India and Pakistan. That hadn't happened before because India is quite sensitive to anyone being involved in security issues such as this. So Gulf states are playing more of a role when it comes to matters of security importance, which is something that India has pushed back when it comes to other states. And there's also a slow move towards more security-related concerns. During that visit by Prime Minister Modi to Saudi Arabia, even though that was quite brief, they also brought up nuclear discussion, which they hadn't talked about before because they usually focus on oil, which was also quite interesting. But I think Kabir might be the person to talk more about this sort of defense, evolution that we've seen with Gulf-India relations.
Yeah, and I think also bringing it back to kind of the trading relationship, I think, we did mention in the beginning that the CEPA and other trade agreements probably have spillovers onto other sectors, but by and large, I think the discussion and expertise we have on the panel is mostly on trading relationship as opposed to defense. But again, very interesting question. And does anyone else have Mennat, if you want to ask your question, and then Akram. Anyone else has any question? All right, we'll take these two last questions and then we'll conclude the panel. Thank you.
When we speak of Gulf and India trade relationships, mostly the focus is UAE, Qatar, and Saudi. So my question is that what more can Oman, Bahrain, and Kuwait do to improve trading relationships with India? I know one of you mentioned a re-export hub, if Oman could offer to become one, or hydrogen, of course, in Oman's case. But could you maybe highlight a few sectors or industries that these countries can try and have a competitive advantage over the bigger three economies of the region? And where can they really, what are the sectors they should be placing their bets on to get India's attention?
All right.
So the first that comes to mind when you talk about a country like Bahrain is banking and finance, because that's been their traditional, strong area. I think India's IT exports, services, products and services, that kind of gels with the requirement of this region across the board. So a country like Bahrain and not Bahrain, the other countries, the three that you mentioned, Kuwait and others, they can work on those lines. And energy, I'll leave Jennifer to address that question.
When it comes to Bahrain, for instance, what they've done recently, and this is mostly geared towards tourism, is liberalized visa access for Indians. I think liberalizing the other processes for businesses and tailoring that. I know Bahrain has been doing this for a while as a gateway to the Saudi market for Indian businesses would be really helpful for them. And Ehtesham has mentioned that IT is a big sector in Bahrain. They had a sandbox a few years ago to enable IT investment. They took early leads in crypto, but Bahrain starts a lot of developments in banking or even in IT, but then, Dubai does catch up and does offer very competitive rates. But I think liberalizing access to Indian businessmen, reducing rates so that it is more competitive when it comes to Dubai and Saudi Arabia would help in a long way. When it comes to Oman, I think there are some sectors which could be of interest to Indian businesses. Green hydrogen, because Oman has been positioning itself as a hub for green hydrogen, and also as a hub that caters to Africa, because India has been pushing for more market access in Africa, and it is easier geographically to do that from the free zones such as Sohar, Duqm, and Salalah.
So I'll just quickly add tourism and medical tourism especially is one area that hasn't been talked about. I remember 7, 8, 10 years ago, there was a lot of focus on medical tourism. That has kind of died down. So I think that it'll be a good platform to revive. And because it benefits both sides, and there is already some synergy existing in that area.
Thank you. I'll take one final question. Akram, if you may.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a fascinating conversation. Just trade distorting measures are oftentimes part of industrial policy nowadays, right? And if you look at the reason why the tariffs were adopted in the first place in the US, it was both because of deindustrialization, reshoring some manufacturing to United States territories, but it was also to fix the trade deficit, which was deemed proof of weakness by the Trump administration. And in the Gulf context, I think this relates to, first, in terms of manufacturing, the diversification of the economies. So if you look at manufacturing from the standpoint of Vision 2030, precisely, it's going to be a major component. But there are also ambitions in terms of developing value chains in industries such as fertilizers, such as steel and others where there is potential here, or electric vehicles, etc., higher up the value chain. So just for the Gulf context, I would have two questions. First, how do you see potential in the CEPAs and free trade discussions in terms of industrialization and added value here in the Gulf states? What value chains could be developed? Could we see regional value chains being developed with India? That's the first question. And the second one is what balances, to say it this way, the trade relationship from a Gulf perspective is also energy exports. With India committing to carbon neutrality by 2070, do you think this could, of course this is longer term, but how could this influence the discussions in terms of free trade between the two players?
Thank you, Akram. It's a very good question, but I'm also mindful of time. So as much as possible, let's keep the
So
answers
I'll sum up in one sentence. Of course, possibilities exist, and as long as industrialization part is concerned, there's a lot that will depend on how we deal with this new phenomenon called AI, and it's rethinking a lot of ways. So I think 10 years from now, industrialization would mean a completely different thing that we've kind of grown up imagining it. So that high-end technology interface is something that will drive a lot of policy decisions when it comes to industrialization. So I think I'll leave it at that, and Jennifer is our energy expert here, so she can take that.
I'll take the last question because it's something that I often talk about. The 2070 goal is 20 years behind the Paris Agreement's 2015. That's because India had a very realistic approach that this 2050 deadline is not achievable, not for a big country like India where millions of people still need to, achieve a basic standard of living. We still have many who need to access several aspects that have been normalized for other economies. So we have a strong sense of we need to make sure that people have access to energy, people have access to other aspects of the energy value chain like plastics. India is going to be a big consumer for the foreseeable future. And meanwhile, our biggest source of energy is coal. So our immediate concern is to move away from coal. That does not necessarily mean we're going to renewables. We do have a renewable energy target, but that has been complicated by issues with China and with the tariffs as well. So India's immediate goal is to make sure that we can at least access oil at affordable rates. And then now the plan is to import natural gas. And that is an ongoing discussion with both ADNOC and with Qatar. And once the value chains, supply chains are normal, to add renewable energy capacity. But India has been very realistic that 2070 is our goal. And from discussions I've had with policy think tanks in the region on renewable energy targets, many countries are revising their own 2050 goals. But India has always said that it is not possible for a large country that is still trying to access, certain types of hydrocarbons to hit that target.
Thank you so much. First of all, please join me in having a round of applause for our wonderful panelists. And then I'd also like to thank ORF Middle East and everyone who's helped in making this event come together, and all the attendees, of course. So a big round of applause to you all, and thank you so much for joining us today.